And it's 12:15. We have a long history at Marquette Law School of being punctual, and we will continue that here. This is not on the issues, and I am not Mike Goucher. Although this is his usual spot and hour. And I do hope this will be a valuable continuation of a series that goes back just under a decade now of public policy programming here, efforts to provide light and interesting conversation on major public issues and matters of all kinds. Who am I? I'm Alan Borsick, that's who I am, and I'm a senior fellow at the law school, and I have the privilege, and I really do think it is one, of being part of the public policy initiative here at the law school. And sometimes I end up sitting up here, which is particularly true when the subject is education, so that's why I'm here, and Mike Goucher is in the back there. 6 months ago, we had an event that was kind of a curious idea, but I thought it really worked out very well. State Representative Dale Kooyenga, who's been a major critic of Milwaukee Public Schools, and Lauren Baker, the executive director of the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association, sat in these two chairs and had a conversation about the future of MPS. These were two people who had never met each other, but had certainly differences of opinion. But it was really worthwhile having that conversation just to stir up people's thinking. So I thought then we ought to do more of this on kind of a careful and deliberate basis. And the first thought I had as a follow-up, not too surprisingly, was vouchers. I think everybody in this room and those who are watching as this is being live streamed in a couple places knows that Milwaukee was the first place in the country to have a private school voucher program. It's a little over a quarter century old. There's now programs across the state, and nearly a quarter of all children in the city of Milwaukee who are getting publicly funded education are doing so through the voucher program in more than 110 schools, almost all of them religious. So it's quite an important change in the landscape here that's had national impact. So that leads us to today, and I did a little brainstorming of who might be interesting people to take part in a conversation on vouchers. Scott Jensen was an easy choice for me on the side of those who support vouchers, and I'm very pleased that he's here today. If I can add a personal note, there was your father died just last week, and the funeral was yesterday. So he's here coming off of a difficult time personally, and I appreciate your willingness to be here in these circumstances. Julie Underwood, I had a few people in mind of who might be really good people who are critics of the voucher program, and a public school sector friend of mine who happens to be in the room at the moment said Julie Underwood, and I said that's a really good idea. To introduce each a little more, Julie is the Susan Engelleiter Professor of Education Law, Policy, and Practice at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She was Dean of the UW School of Education from 2005 to 2015, and she teaches still in both the School of Education and the UW Law School. She has both a PhD and a law degree, and that always scores a lot of points in this building.
At least one of them.
We don't care about PhDs. And
unnecessary.
she previously, prior to coming back, she taught at UW earlier on and was in Madison in other positions. She was previously the Dean of the School of Education at Miami University and was Associate Executive Director and General Counsel of the National School Boards Association. Scott Jensen is the Senior Strategist for the Advancement of School Choice with the American Federation for Children. That name may ring some bells with you, particularly of late. Betsy DeVos, the chair of the Federation, was tabbed by President-elect Trump last week as his choice for Secretary of Education. I suspect that name, Betsy DeVos, will come up in our conversation here. Prior to his current roles, among other things, Scott was the chief of staff for then-Governor Tommy G. Thompson, and was a member of the Wisconsin Assembly for 14 years, including 3 terms as Speaker of the Assembly. He has been involved pretty much from the start as a central figure in developing and shaping the voucher program in Wisconsin. This is not a debate, as I would label it. Some people would call it that. I suppose I wouldn't argue. It is a conversation between 2 highly qualified people with different points of view, and it is going to be done as a conversation. There's no proposition in front of us. There's no one keeping score. We're not going to declare a winner at the end, although you're welcome to have your own opinions. The goal is just to talk about important matters. That said, this is an academic setting, a law school. In fact, this room is designed to serve as a courtroom, and it has served that purpose. So I'm going to ask that you not applaud, interrupt, cheer, shout out, whatever, except for 2 points at which I will invite you to applaud, one of which will be at the end, and one of which will be right now. So let us welcome Scott Jensen and Julie Underwood.
Nobody threw anything.
And even though it's not a debate, we'll begin with what will really amount to an invitation to make an opening statement in the form of a question. What have we learned in broad strokes in a quarter century of vouchers, particularly in Milwaukee, and what does it say about what ought to happen going forward? I think you've been there since the start. We'll give you the first shot, Scott.
Okay, all right. Well, the good thing about the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program is that it's the most studied program in the country. There's been more research done in this program than any other program around the country. And so we've learned a lot over the last 25 years. I'll give you the highlights as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure you'll have a different set of highlights. But here's what we've learned as far as I'm concerned. We've learned that the kids who participate in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program are poorer and start out further behind in school than their peers. It usually takes them about 3 or 4 years at their new school before they get caught up to where they should be. The longer they're in the program, the better they do in school. By the time they reach high school, they are outperforming their peers on the ACT. They are more likely to graduate from high school if they stay in the program. They are more likely to go on to college. They are more likely to graduate from college than their peers, similarly situated. The schools they attend are safer, the students are more engaged in civic life, and they are less likely to commit a crime. And those are all the results of studies that have been done over the course of the last 26 years. I think we have learned, since we were the first state, that there are some things we would do differently if we were to start all over again. I think we would look at accountability, different sorts of accountability measures than we originally had in the program. I think we've learned that you can't just build a marketplace overnight. The whole idea was that you'd create this education marketplace, there would be consumers, they would make the best choices on behalf of their children. Well, you can't have an education marketplace unless you have what we have in other marketplaces. Consumer Digest that tells you what the best schools are, rankings of schools, some sort of ratings of how good schools are, information about what is taught and what isn't taught at various schools. And so we've only now, sadly, 25 years in, are beginning to get to that level where that sort of information is available for parents. That's something that should have been done, I think, long ago. With regards to accountability, I think the regulations were too much focused on inputs and not enough focused on outcomes, because it's outcomes that are most important. So those are some of the changes we've made, and I think some of the things we've learned over the last 25 years.
Julie, your thoughts?
Well, I think that we'll probably go back and talk about some of the research. The research that you present, I think, is kind of mixed and matched, and I wouldn't say that it's as strong as you point out. But I'd like to think about actually where this program came from. It's been in place for a long time, as you say, and before you think about whether it was successful, I think you have to think about where it came from and what it was intended to do. Now, one thing that we share is that we were both there, weren't we?
Yes.
In 1990, when the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program started, you were chief of staff for then Governor Tommy Thompson, right?
Yes.
And I was interim general counsel for Burt Grover. You remember Burt Grover?
He's kind of hard to forget, actually.
Tommy Thompson's kind of hard to forget,
Yeah, that's
too.
true, too.
And if I recall,
Burt Grover was the state superintendent of public instruction.
yeah, Burt Grover was state superintendent of public instruction then, and he and Tommy Thompson didn't get along very well. They would kind of go toe-and-toe about all sorts of things, mainly education, but one of the things that they would go toe-to-toe about was the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. So that year, I was hired to be interim general counsel, and what I was supposed to do was get through a backlog of hearings, which I intended to do until Tommy Thompson, I believe he came back from an ALEC conference, and had with him, or at least that's the way he told it on public radio one time, and had with him the outline for a school voucher program. And he put it in the budget bill, which is, oddly, in the state of Wisconsin, how we do lots of public policy. We put things in the budget bill. He put it in the budget bill, and of course, and it passed. At that point, though, it went to the Department of Public Instruction to try and figure out how to implement that program. And as general counsel, we were set forth to write rules and regulations on the implementation of this program. And that's where I started with the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. So trying to think about, at that point, where this program came from, you know, it was an experimental program at that point. The first year, about $700,000 spent. We've come a long way in the number of years that the program has been in place. So it's now a $200 million program. It was experimental at that point. And you think about, well, what was it designed to achieve? And when I think about that, I think about the roots of choice programs and the roots of this particular choice program. So, you know, choice programs, in my mind, and doing research over these years, their roots lie in segregation. In choice programs that originally were created in the South after Brown versus the Board of Education to avoid integration. So there were that was the term that was used, choice academies. And they were intended so that students wouldn't have to integrate. They closed, in a number of southern states, they closed the public schools and gave children a voucher or choice so that they could go to private schools. And in those days, you know, many private schools wouldn't accept African American students, so those students had no choice. And the United States Supreme Court did finally hold those programs to be unconstitutional, but that's the choice academy, or the voucher, you know, has its roots in that kind of history. It lay dormant for a long time. You know, that was Milton Friedman and the choice academies, until the first piece that I can find is in ALEC's Education Guidebook in 1985. And there's an outline of what should be done, or an education agenda that's laid out in an education book by ALEC. It's hard to find in 1985 because that was kind of underground at that point. But ALEC at that point in 1985 suggested that the solution for public education was universal vouchers, or choice. And what they were trying to solve was the problem, as they laid it out in the guidebook, the education source book, I think is the name of it. What they said was the federal government and the United States Supreme Court and other federal courts have created a problem for public education, and that is that public education, I think of myself as part of public education, are responsible to everybody. You know, we have to do integration, we have to do special education, English language learning, low-income students, all of those things. And in the ALEC agenda, it says something to the effect of, well, since public schools have to do all of that and have to serve everybody, they really don't serve anybody's interests. And the solution should be universal vouchers. Because if you had a universal voucher or a voucher in every child's backpack, then the power would be within the private schools or within individual schools, and we wouldn't need any system of education. We wouldn't need school districts and we wouldn't need elected school boards because parents and individual schools could kind of have that kind of contract themselves, and there wouldn't be this structure and regulation. So the gist of it, in my mind, was kind of an escape, and that was the goal. An escape from diversity, an escape from all sorts of different kinds of children, an escape from public regulation, to a universal voucher program. And personally, I believe that that hasn't been achieved, thank goodness. And if I think about if that were to be achieved, at what cost, I think it would be at huge cost in the United States, since the goal of public education is actually to make sure that we educate all citizens, all people, actually all people who reside in the United States, not just citizens, all people who reside in the United States within public education so they can participate, so that they can be active participants in our economy and active participants in our democracy, so that they can think about public issues and vote and serve on juries and all sorts of good things. Many people don't think serving on juries are good things, but particularly in a law school, that's a part of your civic tradition and an important part. And I think that is an important part. The United States Supreme Court and many other courts have found that the notion of a public education, one that's publicly accessible, publicly accountable, public curriculum, and passing along public values is important and is probably one of the most important functions of government.
As you can imagine, my view of how the program was created is a little bit different than yours. I was there. I was in the room when Polly Williams came in to speak with Tommy Thompson. Polly Williams, an African-American Democratic state representative here from Milwaukee, had been fighting for more than a year to increase the input that the black community had in education in this city. This city's Milwaukee Public Schools at the time, the leadership was all white, the leadership at the schools was white, African-American families were bused all over the city, way out of their neighborhoods, and Polly Williams went around for more than a year with this huge chart about how her kids from her neighborhood were being bused 45 minutes to other places when there was a good school down the street. Why couldn't they just go to the neighborhood school, and why can't we in the African-American community have more say over our schools? So she came into Governor Thompson and proposed that we carve out a section of the Milwaukee Public Schools on the north side that would be a black school district. And that would allow the black community here to run its own school district. And Governor Thompson, being a lawyer, explained, well, I'm not sure that would be constitutional. We're already under a desegregation order. But what if we allowed the parents to choose what school their kids would go to? And Polly thought about it and agreed that that was the right answer. It would give people the chance in the black community to start schools. It would allow African-American parents to send their kids to a school that they thought was right for their kid. So that's how the program got started. It was those two individuals came to an agreement about what they thought would be best for some of the poorest children in this city.
What have we learned? Go ahead.
I just want to, well,
honestly, I was right there.
but
I was in the back. I was a young staffer.
Had Governor Tommy Thompson actually thought about his constitutional law, he would have remembered that freedom of choice plans, which were also part of desegregation orders, so that you could go to any school you wanted to which in some senses would avoid integration, was also found unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court, and he probably would have remembered that. And he
But it
probably,
ended up being right,
probably
because
did.
it was found constitutional by the state Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court. So we know school choice is constitutional.
Yes, yes, yes. We know school choice is constitutional in that way, and the Supreme Court case that you're referring to actually just deals with religion. But that freedom of choice kind of piece as part of integration was found to be unconstitutional. But, you know, we also have a saying that's politics has strange bedfellows.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you have two issues which may be different and in some ways taken to the nth degree, diametrically opposed, that come together and happen upon a similar solution, even though the end result that each group may want to advance may be very different.
At the time the Milwaukee program was created, some of the advocates for it, national figures, were using terms like panacea. It wasn't. Here we are, it's 2016, the gaps between white kids and black kids in all the sectors in Milwaukee remain huge. The outcomes based on state test scores, and I'm aware of the studies you mentioned, Scott, on the state test scores, there really isn't too much difference between voucher kids and Milwaukee Public School kids. Why hasn't the gap closed?
Well, I think there's a couple.
What have we learned about the gap?
Well, I'm going to agree with you that if you look at the third grade tests and the eighth grade tests, that there's not much of a difference. The scores are very similar. If you look at the studies that were done on the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, what they generally found is that in those earlier years, they're tracking about the same. What you do find, though, is that there is, to use a phrase that people now popular in education, there seems to be more grit involved in the kids who are in the private schools. They stay in school for a longer period of time. They are, if they continue into high school, they now, just this year, we require all the kids to take the same test, right? All the publicly funded students, they all took the ACT test, right? Well, the kids in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program outscored their peers in the Milwaukee Public Schools. The kids in the Racine Parental Choice Program outscored their peers in the Racine schools. The kids in the statewide program outscored their peers by 5 points on the ACT. And as the father of a senior who's been worried about trying to get his ACT score up there, 5 points increase would be great. So they have done well. I agree that in the earlier years you don't see the academic progress. It's not the panacea that lots of people thought it would be at the start. It's also not the nightmare that people thought it would be at the start. So the critics were wrong, the proponents were wrong, the answer is somewhere in between, which is not a surprise in life. But there is progress being made here. And there are kids who are getting into college who wouldn't have gotten into college, kids doing better on the ACTs than they would have done, kids graduating from high school. And graduating from high school is like the first key to success in life. And there's a lot more kids who are doing that because of this program.
Your thoughts on why the gap has been so persistent and across the sectors?
Well, let's look at the research, because that's where you started, right? Let's look at the research. And at the University of Wisconsin, we do some research, and we think about methodology of research, and that's pretty important. I think that a lot of the reports or interpretation of the research that's been done, including the research on the Milwaukee program, but research across the United States, has been overstated in many ways, and there's some problems with it. So one thing is that a lot of the programs are very different across the United States, and so generalizability is a problem. So looking at research in one program, because they are very different programs, it's hard to generalize the Louisiana versus the Wisconsin kind of research or the Florida research. But we also know that it's important how you interpret results. I think the American public noticed something, and a lot of political pundits noticed something called a margin of error after the election. The night of the election or the day after the election. It's important to make sure that when you see an effect, that you recognize that that may not really be the effect that you think it is. It may be within a margin of error. So it may not have a significant difference. There may not be a significant difference. You may not be able to state that these, the results really are not only not generalizable, but they really may not be there because of the significance. Also, when you think about methodology, trying to figure out how to test kids and how to do paired comparisons is always very different, because when you're testing and assessing children and learning, it may not be rocket science, because it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to figure out how children grow and develop and how they learn. So you have to be very careful how you do any kind of methodology. When you're looking at those methodologies, one of the things that you want to make sure is, are these populations actually the same? Are the children the same? And I know that as the Milwaukee program is continued, we oftentimes, and some of the research that you're citing, actually measures low-income children and low-income children. Well, as we've taken the income caps or moved the income caps off, really it's not low-income children. We should be, comparing all of the children in Milwaukee Public Schools versus the children who are in voucher programs, because 4 out of 5 families in Milwaukee, I believe, would be eligible for the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program at this point. And lots of other programs have no income caps, they're universal. Also, there are other things that actually drive children's learning. You said grit, resiliency is an important one. How do you actually do paired comparisons on resiliency? Because we know that's important. We also know what's incredibly important is the kind of children that are in the schools. So special education is important. The Milwaukee Public Schools has probably about 20% special education students, and the Milwaukee Voucher Program, or the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, has probably 3% at special education students. So there's a difference between those groups of people. Also, there could be a difference between these groups of students based on their parents, and their parents, even John Whitty found that with the college graduate study, that those parents actually have a higher education level than the average child in the Milwaukee Public Schools. And I would suggest that the biggest difference is parental involvement, because we know that that's like a huge driver in children's learning is parental involvement. And if you have parents who are involved in your learning and involved enough in your learning to move you from school to school, you are so much more likely to have a parent who's going to help you learn, and a parent that supports you, right, and a parent that builds resilience.
That's one of the points behind choice, is to get parents more involved in the decision.
To get parents involved.
Well, let's talk about parental choice itself.
Okay.
That the Milton Friedman idea going back 6 decades was that if you give parents choice, everyone would make a good choice, not the same choices, and that would drive quality.
Not quite, though. I mean,
okay.
So I know nothing about cars. I really don't want to spend time researching what car to buy. But when it comes time for me to get a new car, what do? I ask friends and neighbors.
Don't ask me.
I won't. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I ask friends and neighbors what kind of car makes sense. I look quickly online in some sort of rating and ranking. People don't necessarily have to do all that research themselves. They watch what the rest of the people around them who have similar interests do. So not every parent has to do all of that research, and the market is driven by smaller groups of people. So the problem we had here in Milwaukee and in much of the school choice movement around the country at the start was none of that base information was there, right? People hadn't shopped before for school, right? They hadn't had to choose what school they went to. They got a note at home that said you are in the attendance area for Clarendon Elementary School, and that's where they went to school. Once people were given the chance to have a choice, we didn't step in to help parents. There was no market that developed to give them information about the quality of the schools, about the ratings behind the schools, what schools had, what strengths some schools had and other schools didn't have. And that made it, I think, very, very difficult. Now, we do have, just here in the last year or so, we have all the students, public and private, are taking the same tests. All the schools will be receiving a report card. We will be able, over time, to see how those schools do, particularly in promoting growth in academic achievement over time. And I think that's going to make it much, much better.
But we have learned that parents, in fairly large numbers, will make what I would regard as bad choices.
Well, and you and I both would say that's a
schools.
bad academic choice, but I'd like to make a couple points, and this might be a middle-class thing here.
Yeah.
We often think, okay, what is the best school for my child academically? But there are a lot of parents in this city who their first choice is safety. Where can I send my kid to school that I know they're coming home okay? And that is a legitimate choice. I mean, as a parent, that's a legitimate choice. It's to say, I'm going to send my kid to a school that's just as good or not as good as my neighborhood school, but I know they're going to come home all right. That is a legitimate choice to make. And a lot of parents in this city make that choice.
But I've been in voucher schools, some of which are still in existence, that maybe want to figure out where the 911 for education emergencies was.
Right. And I agree with you. We need to find a way to increase the number of high-performing schools in this city in all sectors so that there's more opportunities in traditional public schools, charter schools, and private schools, and find a way to squeeze out the poor-performing schools, whether they are public schools or private schools or charter schools. And we have to do that beyond just giving parents choice. And we support those sort of consequences and that sort of accountability at the American Federation for Children.
Your thoughts on the power or lack thereof of parental choice?
Well, I agree with you, choice. I mean, this was certainly not a panacea. It may have been a panacea for a sector of the economy that created entrepreneurial schools, but beyond them, it hasn't been a panacea for parents, and it hasn't been a panacea for children. And I'm glad that I heard you say that, parents make choices in different ways, because children are not cars,
right,
and they're not widgets. And so just looking at a Consumer's Digest isn't going to work in driving a change,
right, but
or driving a
one
choice.
size doesn't fit all. So why would we send all kids to the same school? Why wouldn't we let parents within their family choose the school that makes the most sense for each of their kids? There's a lot of families in this city where they send one kid to a public school, another one to a charter school, because different kids learn differently. And so therefore you wouldn't send them all to the same school being run exactly the same way.
Well, I think that we individualize a lot of instruction, and we, of course, know that the best instruction is individualized instruction. But we also have to pay attention that there are some parents who will make choices on different reasons, all sorts of different reasons. It may be expediency. How can I get my child to school? It may be just based on family tradition. It may be all sorts of things. But I think that within the public sector, we have a lot of choices for children as well. If you just think about having children within a school engaging in different activities and learning in different ways, there are significant forms of academic choice. My concern is when you have programs which are not good at the outset. Schools, a number of schools in Milwaukee that have failed, choice schools that have failed in the beginning, in the very first year, or a number of choice schools that have failed over the last 20 years, and most of them are entrepreneurial schools. I mean, 40% of the choice schools have failed. And when I say fail, I mean closed. And we know that's bad for kids because it's not good on mobility when your school closes.
Bad schools should close.
They
That's
should.
the whole point.
No, I think that trying to make sure, have some sense of assurance that you aren't going to send a child to an academically bad school, like where you need academic 911. So if you think about the inputs in the regulations to ensure that what instruction a child is going to receive is good instruction, that there's good curriculum. To me, that's an important piece. Because once a child goes to school, you know, a child's only 9 once. They can't do that over.
Right.
And a child's learning developmentally is incredibly important, particularly for children who are low income or children at risk for other factors. So I want to make sure, as best as you can, to make sure that kids have a good chance when they're going to school.
This is one area where I think we can agree upon. I mean, I would like to see this community in particular. I mean, we're in a city, well, first of all, we're in a state with the largest achievement gap between African American students and white students in the nation, Wisconsin. Last in the country. And you know what? This city isn't the worst in Wisconsin. The achievement gap is worse in Madison. That is a stain on this state's reputation. That should make people stay awake at night trying to figure out what is wrong here. And what should happen is people should be working together to try to increase the number of high-performing schools across all these sectors. And then let parents pick the one that's right for them. Even within the Milwaukee Public Schools, they've done a good job of trying to provide all sorts of new opportunities for kids. There are schools that are Montessori schools. My kids, when they were younger, went to a Montessori school. That is a completely different curriculum than they're now getting at the Elmbrook schools, right? Completely different. The same. So within Milwaukee, you have a host of choices. It's okay to have lots of different options because different kids, even within the same family, learn differently. We just need to all work together to try to create more of those high-performing schools. Unfortunately, what I see too often happen in this town in particular is that we have adults defending failure, adults protecting failure. You have empty schools in this city, right? Surplus schools that are not being used. And you have high-performing schools, charter schools, choice schools, and public schools that would like to expand. Are they given a chance to get those buildings? Not very easily. We should be squeezing out the bad schools and helping create more high-performing schools in this city. Instead, people come forward to the Milwaukee Public School Board and they say, we have a waiting list at the 2 international baccalaureate schools in this town, right? They're both extraordinarily high-performing. They're among the best high schools in the state of Wisconsin.
Reagan and King.
Reagan and King. Let's create a third one. Oh, no, we can't do that. That would be elitist. You're kidding me. There are kids waiting to get into Rufus King and to Ronald Reagan. Why isn't there a third school? So that more kids would have that opportunity. We should all be working towards that. The same with the charter schools. I was pleased last year, to the surprise of a lot of people, when the Milwaukee Public School Board decided to work with Carmen to create another campus. And there was all sorts of politics around that decision, but in the end, Michael Bonds and a couple other people on that board cast the right vote. A high-performing charter school is now working side by side with a traditional public school. There's got to be a lot more of that in this town.
So what's been the impact on MPS of the voucher program? I'll give Julie the first turn on this.
I believe that also a question of research that correlation is not causation. And I believe that MPS has worked hard over the last 20 years to improve results for children and has come up with many more innovative programs and has done a better and better job. There are some high-performing schools in MPS.
Absolutely.
There are some great performing schools, public schools across the United States and across the state of Wisconsin as well. And there are some schools which really need to do a better job. I don't think that the causation for school improvement, I don't think you can lay that at the feet of the voucher program. There have been community efforts and there are higher standards. There is more regulation and there is more accountability. The reason we know more about the achievement gap is because of accountability measures at the state and national level. So I think that we've done a lot to drive school improvement over the last
26 years in the voucher
26
program.
years, over the last 26 years, but I can't say that school improvement was caused by a voucher program.
Here's what I would say the impact has been on the Milwaukee Public Schools. I think that the competition from independent charter schools and from private choice schools has forced MPS to adopt things they might not have normally done, right? I mean, I've worked in the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy doesn't do things unless it feels threatened. then it feels that, well, we have to make some changes around here. So that's why I think you've seen MPS try different things. They've created lots of different opportunities for kids. They have, they did go from one international baccalaureate school to two. I think that the competition had something to do with that. Unfortunately, I think people are dragging their feet, and they just are they're so much more interested in protecting the institution than in helping the kids. And I just think we have to work harder together, all of us, to upgrade all three different sectors in this city. Choice isn't going to end. It's here for good. So let's give all the parents in this city and across the state high-quality options to choose from. We should all be able to agree.
So let's look to the future here, starting with the Wisconsin scene. You've got a growing voucher scene in Racine, starting to grow in statewide and will grow more. Now you have special ed vouchers, and that, my guess, is going to grow rapidly. Is there room for a public school stream and a voucher stream in Wisconsin? Room financially, for one thing. And then part two of the question, which you can take on both if you want, is what is going to happen in the legislature? You have a very pro-voucher, pro-school choice cast to the Capitol these days. Yeah, Scott, you go first this time.
I'm always puzzled by this whole thing about the idea of funding two systems. We're sitting here at Marquette University. In America's higher education system, we provide financial aid to students from the state level and the federal level. And the students get to choose what school they go to, whether they go to UWM or whether they go to Marquette. And we don't say we can't afford to fund both systems. What we're saying is we're funding the students. We're providing a scholarship for the students to go to the school of their choice. And what is America's higher education system? The best in the world. People come from all over the place to come to the United States to get their degrees. That's what we should be doing in K through 12, and that's what we're trying to do. So what do I think the legislature will do in Wisconsin? I think they will, each of these programs got created in a different time in Wisconsin's history. They all have a completely different set of regulations on them. Some schools try to participate in all the programs as a nightmare for them because they're all regulated differently, have different requirements, duplicate paperwork for everything. My guess is that the legislature will try to simplify the rules and regulations, sort of move the programs together, and allow them to grow at a natural rate and expand. There are already 25 school districts in Wisconsin where there are waiting lists for kids who would like to go to a choice school. They don't have that option right now because it hit one of the caps. There's all these different caps inside the program, and they don't get the chance to do that in Green Bay or in Appleton. And so my guess is that the legislature will lift that amount. I also think that the legislature's number one priority for this next session will be to increase funding of traditional public schools. I really don't have any doubt about it. They heard that, I think, loud and clear from people across the state of Wisconsin when they were campaigning this year. Even though the Republicans picked up seats in both houses of the legislature, many of them campaigned on the notion that when I get back to Madison, our highest priority is going to be to increase funding for education. I think that's what the legislature will do.
Julie, your thoughts on what's ahead?
Well,
in Wisconsin.
Well, let me start with the analogy to higher education, because it does concern me the way that we fund higher education in the United States has some problems. I have been a university administrator for a long time, but I think there is a significant difference between higher education and K-12. One, because we absolutely need universal public access for K-12. Without it, we can't have a democracy. And the way we fund higher education, unfortunately, leaves lots of students with lots of debt because they may go to a school, but a lot of their tuition is paid for through loans, leaves them with lots of debt. And it also makes that gap that you were talking about even more stark. It is more likely for a low-achieving, high-income student to go to college than a high-achieving, low-income student to go to college, right? It's backwards, completely backwards, and it doesn't work for a lot of students, and it doesn't work for a lot of families. So I don't I don't appreciate that analogy, and I hope that public education doesn't go to that same path, which is unfortunate. You know, the roots of higher education are quite different than the roots of K-12 education in the United States for a good reason. Also, if we think about what's going to happen in Wisconsin, it's expensive. We have a program that now costs us $247 million. That $700,000 experimental program with all of the other programs right now costs us $247 million. All at a time when the state of Wisconsin has been one of the biggest public school cutters in the United States. Since 2008, we have cut and cut and cut and cut public education and instead sent money to private education. Lots of other states have come back and started spending again after the Great Recession and a recovery. Lots of states have come back and spent, but Wisconsin is among the top 5 that have continued to cut or have not reinvested. So it concerns me that the solution would be to continue to shift resources from public to private, or to shift the bill to the public schools, taking money out of the public school fund and sending it to private school at the same time that we're cutting funds for public schools.
Yeah, this is where we just have a different vision, I guess, of public education. You see it as we have to fund the system. And in my belief is we are funding the children. We are making a public investment in each child's future. And it doesn't change the cost. Indeed, it saves money when a child gets a $7,200 voucher to go to a private school versus spending $14,000 here at MPS to educate the child in the public system. There is not a net increase in the cost to the taxpayers writ large, local and state, if you have an expansion of the voucher program. The voucher program has been saving the state of Wisconsin about $50 million a year over the course of the last several years.
I'm not sure how that works, though, because there's just an issue of math.
Yeah.
There's just an issue of math. So I understand the difference between 7,000 and, you know, the average 10,000 or 14,000 in MPS. That math is fine. But the math that I think is a bit faulty there is that a lot of the time what we've seen in our programs and in the new programs in Wisconsin, not the special ed program, but in other programs in the state of Wisconsin, once you remove the income gap, the income ceilings, is that we see a shift. It's not just that children are being pulled out of public schools and going to private schools. A lot of children who participate in the voucher programs, or as I refer to them, the publicly funded private school programs, they were private school students before. So all we're doing is shifting the pay. We're shifting the bill. We're not shifting the students.
That is the case, because the first kids that know that they are eligible for the program are children who are already in private schools.
And so we just changed the bill.
After that, what happens is they're mostly switchers, as we call them, kids who go from public schools to private schools. And in fact, you saw just recently.
I don't think the data proved that.
The new DPI data just shows that the first 2 years, there was first year it was 73% were kids in the statewide program. The first year it was 73% of the kids came from the private school. Why? Because the private school already knew we have kids whose families qualify for free and reduced price lunch. You know, your parents could actually get a voucher from the state to go to the school. So those are the first kids to learn about it. Then the word spreads, other people learn about it. So the first year it was 73% of the kids came from private schools. This year there's a majority of the kids are coming from public schools. And if you look at the other programs historically, it grows and grows and grows, and it mostly becomes overwhelmingly children who are coming from public schools. And that's why the Nonpartisan Fiscal Bureau says that this program saves the state of Wisconsin money.
I want to get Julie's response to the question of whether Wisconsin can afford both a vibrant public school scene and a vibrant voucher scene.
I'm not sure that our currently elected officials are willing to spend money on a vibrant public education scene. I think that what we've seen is their willingness to shift funds to the private sector, and I do believe that we are seeing more and more children continuing to go to just be tuition shifters. They're not school shifters, so that the bill continues to go, money comes out of the public schools and pays for the tuition for the private students. And if you look at all of the programs except the special ed program, I think that continues to happen. And so if you're going to be paying for the private school students and increasing the number of students you pay for, what you're going to do is, what they have done so far, is decrease the amount of money going into the public schools, and at the same time, we are increasing the cost of the cost of services to our public school students who are left in the public schools, because we do, in the public schools, we accept all students. We accept all students. So whether it's a choice student, a voucher student, a publicly funded private school student who goes into a private school and then changes his or her mind or gets removed from the private school, they come back to us and we take them, because that's what we do. Special education students, and some of those students are more expensive.
I was just going to say, since the program was created 26 years ago, it says right in the law that the schools participating in the program must take all students, and they cannot pick and choose. They can't cherry pick the kids they want. They have to take the kids, and if there is more kids applying than there are seats in that kindergarten or that first grade, we run a lottery. We've done it that way every year, and I am amazed, 26 years in, that people still are trying to suggest that these schools get to pick their kids. They don't. They don't. Everyone is allowed to go, everyone who qualifies.
We could spend a lot of time on that. I want to move on to one thing before our time runs out, and I just would say, I know what
Where
the
has
response.
the time gone?
I'm having fun.
Good.
The response, I know, would be kids who exit and not kids who enter. But let me move on to some. How about that Donald Trump?
You didn't do this at Thanksgiving, did you?
No, definitely not. Definitely not. And Betsy DeVos.
Yeah.
You are close with Betsy DeVos.
Yeah, I've had the honor of working for Betsy DeVos for the last 7 years.
My question is, what do you expect to happen on the national scene? The $20 billion fund Trump has talked about, what's going to happen?
Well, I think you will find in Betsy DeVos that you have a new Secretary of Education who is smart, who is driven, who is demanding, who is visionary. I have found her also be very practical and very willing to listen. She may walk in with a preconceived notion, but that doesn't hold for long when it meets with the facts. If someone presents to her a situation and says that's not going to work here, she moves to what can work. She's very much a what works person. That's the way she has been in business. That's the way she's been in philanthropy. She's been extraordinarily successful in her life, and I expect her to be very successful as the Secretary of Education. I'm surprised she wanted to do it. Having been in public service and seeing the sort of trashing you get and the way it all works, I'm surprised she was willing to do it, but she said to me she just thought this was an opportunity to help kids, that she would never be able to do this in any other position she had, whether in business or in philanthropy. This was the best opportunity in her life to help kids. So that's what she's taking it as. The president's proposal is like much of the Trump agenda. The president's proposal is pretty vague. The president just said we're going to have a $20 billion plan to provide more options for children to attend different schools all across the country. I don't know what that means. We're happy to work with him on that. We have a lot of suggestions. First of all, the federal government doesn't have much of a role in education. Monetarily, it's really quite small, the role they have. They have a great role in Washington, D.C., right? They pay for the education in Washington, D.C., so my guess is that program will expand. The federal government pays for the education of the children in our military all over the country. A lot of people think they go to base schools. No, most kids, children in the military go to a local school. Only recently have they now allowed them to go to local charter schools around the country. My guess is that's a possible area for expansion. The federal government does have a big role in special education. People have tried in the past essentially voucherize special education to give people more opportunities. Perhaps that'll come up. Marco Rubio has a piece of legislation that would be a scholarship tax credit program, which other states have, but thankfully Wisconsin doesn't have, where people get a tax credit for making contributions to scholarship funds that would send kids, will allow kids to go to the school of their choice. Something like that might be done at the federal level as well. But it's early, and the white paper during the campaign was pretty brief.
About this big. Your thoughts on
So all of
this?
All of the descriptions that that you used for this nominee didn't include educational qualifications, and I think that of the names that we saw come floating around, that this was probably the least traditionally qualified nominee for Secretary of Education. Michelle Rhee and a number of other very conservative educators. And so it's surprising in that fact. It's not surprising in that, since that's true, it looks as if this is a signal of an interest in privatization, an interest in deregulation, because that's, at least commonly, that's two of the things that she's known for privatization.
Are you aware of her work with the Grand Rapids Public School District over the last several years, working with a new superintendent to try to transform that school district? One of her biggest cheerleaders is the public school superintendent of Grand Rapids. She has found Betsy DeVos to be invaluable in the work that she's trying to do to turn that school district around. So she's worked with the public school system. They started a charter school. They've been involved in the private school movement. She has worked across the spectrum in education.
Your reaction to the $20 billion?
I am very hopeful that the $20 billion goes to support the infrastructure and the children across the United States.
Could either of you see yourselves taking a role in the DeVos Department of Education?
I love working for her, but I like Wisconsin. I don't want to go to Washington, D.C. I've passed up chances to go to D.C. many times.
Okay, just wondering.
I don't think considering the privatization and deregulation, I don't think I'd.
I admit I only had one person seriously in mind on that.
Was that a rhetorical comment?
Well, I have trouble seeing you in the DeVos administration. So, last thought and kind of a closing comment from each of you. Bad schools. What's the future of bad schools in both Milwaukee and Wisconsin? I hope it would be a bleak one, but I'm not so sure.
I'm hoping they become rare.
And if so, what would make them rare? What do we need to do?
I think there are adults on all sides who need to step up here, that there are policymakers who need to step up and stop defending failure, whether it is in the private schools, in the choice program, some of the charter schools that are weak, or some of the public schools in Milwaukee that are weak. We all have to step up here and either repair those schools or replace them with high-performing schools.
I believe that every child deserves a great education. And I think that people who are willing to support children receiving a great education should be supported. I believe that we need to pay attention at the front end to make sure that there are lots of conditions to make sure that children have a great education in terms of health and safety and curriculum and those pieces as well, and that we need to hold everybody, all of the adults accountable for that. But I believe in public access of public education and universal access to education. And I don't believe that any kind of universal vouchers or a privatization of all of our programs actually leads us there.
Any last thoughts from either of you more
I'll
broadly?
let her have the last word, that's all right.
And I'm going to, with regrets, because we could go on for a long time here, and maybe we will in some future setting, I'm going to say that we're going to wrap it up here. It's going to be a really interesting time ahead in Madison, in Washington, and most important, what's going to happen out there in the schools that are so important. All of these schools, all of these children, especially those who have historically been dealt the hands least likely to produce success. The one thing I've said publicly myself, and I'd echo what I think both of you were saying largely, is everybody has to pitch in, and I want to especially thank each of you for being involved in your own ways in this intensely important subject and for being here. So thank you, Julie. Thank you,
Alan.
Scott. Thank you to all of you for being with us.